it. As Zainab mentioned, my project compares Ottoman and Victorian female novelists, particularly looking at how they use music as a metaphor for the female voice in modernizing societies. I look at 6 novelists, but tonight we'll focus on Halide Edib. In the project, I juxtapose her with George Eliot, also known as Marian Evans. And through the lens of one of Halide Edib's novels, we will consider the interrelated nature of westernizing modernity, nationalism, spirituality, and gender in the late Ottoman Empire and the early Turkish Republic. She first published this novel in English and then a year later in Turkish. And I will argue that she uses the Quran recitations of the female protagonist as a metaphor for the woman's voice in late Ottoman society, as well as the ideal resolution she sees for the tension between Eastern and Western perspectives in the early Turkish Republic. In her 1923 memoirs, Halide Edib describes her own persistence, or stubbornness, if you will, her determination for her voice to be heard all the way into the Sultan's quarters. She was very young, maybe 4 years old, when she made her voice project that far. Her father was private treasurer for Sultan Abdulhamid II, and he had stayed overnight in the palace complex for work. She had recently lost her mother, so she was very attached to her father and refused to be without him that night. So she started to yell, and no one in the household could quiet her. The housekeeper poured cold water over her head, and that didn't work. So finally, they had a male servant carry her through the nighttime streets of Constantinople to Yıldız Palace to see her father. So she projected her voice at that point, and then in 1919, she projected her voice for an audience of about 200,000 gathered in Sultanahmet Square after the Greek occupation of Smyrna. There are many factors that influenced her ability to amplify her voice, but I think 3 particularly are worth considering. The first one was her father's government connection, which allowed her to grow up in discussions among the social elite and gave her a privileged education involving multiple languages. She was advanced in her proficiency in English, which allowed her to publish this novel, for example, in English, as well as other nonfiction. And that projected her voice internationally. Secondly, was also the historic moment of transition from empire into republic with World War and the occupation. It was a platform for international attention, which Mustafa Kemal used, and was also an opportunity for Halide Edib. But then third, and I think not to be underrated, is her remarkable character. She was an extraordinary woman. The biography by İpek Çalışlar of Halide Edib is called Biyografisine Sığmayan Kadın, the woman who doesn't fit into her own biography. And this evening we'll explore some of the reasons that that title is so apt for her life. Her ideological journey traces intellectual movements from late Ottoman Constantinople into the Republic. She describes her rare private education in English in this way. She was, in her words, quote, nourished by both the Eastern and Western culture. She either listens to the prayers of her Sufi grandma or feels the influences of the English discipline that an Occidental father admires, end quote. She was one of the first graduates and few Muslim students of the American College in Constantinople. Her influence domestically, and when I say domestically, I mean within Turkey, although I'm sure she was very influential at home with her 2 husbands and her 2 sons. But her influence domestically began with her journalism in 1908, not only in women's journals, as with Fatma Aliye and Nezihe Muhiddin, but in the journal Tanın through her father's connections. The Young Turks designated her, quote, mother of Turks. She gave speeches and lectures at Istanbul University at a time when women were not lecturing in front of male audiences in Europe, for example. She had a British activist friend, Isabel Fry, who writes to another friend in a letter in astonishment that Halide Edib in the Ottoman Empire is lecturing at a university with an audience of men. Because she had this friendship with Isabel Frye, she and Isabel had several reciprocal visits between England and Turkey, in which Halide Edib learned about the British suffragette movement in England, and it affected her. Then after that, she served as a military officer next to Mustafa Kemal in the War for Turkish Independence, and then also as a member of parliament from 1950 to 1954. As an academic and a writer, Halide Edib founded the English Language and Literature Department at Istanbul University and guest lectured at Columbia University, among many others. She published 21 novels, in addition to her journalism and scholarly nonfiction, such as her book Inside India, which was published by Oxford University Press. She also interacted personally with an array of international figures, such as Mahatma Gandhi, the painter Alphonse Mucha, and the philosopher Bertrand Russell. So you begin to understand why she was the woman who doesn't fit into her own biography. Sevinç Eleman-Garner describes her influence in, quote, generating the discourse concerning the image of the new Turkish woman, being herself, quote, a model of ideal Turkish womanhood in her career, as I've mentioned, as an educator, military officer, orator, member of parliament, and as Eleman-Garner says, quote, cosmopolitan intellectual, end quote. In her journalism and her fiction, Halide Edib addresses issues of education for women, polygamy, and equality in marriage. These concerns parallel a sociological concept in 19th century Britain, which was called the New Woman, which spotlighted issues in Victorian society, such as education, work, and agency for women, as well as gender-based double standards in marriage, both socially and legally. The divided skirt and the bicycle became symbols of this new woman and her increased mobility and independence. In this photo you see on the right, an illustration from Puck magazine in 1895. And then on the left is Fatma Aliye, recognized as the first female novelist in Turkish literature, and she's posing with her bicycle, and I think a very confident expression, in apparent solidarity with the new woman. This construct of the new woman has been applied to writers, including male writers, such as Thomas Hardy and George Meredith. Frankly, the male writers are better known, with a wide spectrum of positions. So it's difficult to define. On the one side, you have some writers like Mary Dunn, also known as George Egerton, for instance, who didn't even support women's suffrage. And many more conservative, like Charlotte Bronte, maintain the value of traditional marriage and motherhood, but advocated reforms, legal reforms particularly, related to labor and divorce laws. While others, like Mona Caird, in her famous essay, 1888 essay, challenged the institution of marriage itself. Novelist Sarah Grand is often referenced for coining the term, the new woman, in an article in 1894, but the Oxford English Dictionary first references this term, the new woman, in an 1865 issue of the Westminster Review, so decades earlier. At this much earlier date, the writer is already strongly criticizing the concept of the new woman as an established and controversial concept to be opposed for its threat to society, with its implications particularly for marriage, for family, and even for the economy. Reviewing a very popular novel by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, the author of this article in the Westminster Review decries the, quote, creed. He calls it a creed of the new woman. So he's using religious overtones. He says, quote, she is no longer the angel, but the devil in the house. This was a very famous Victorian phrase for the idealized domestic female figure, the angel in the house. So he's saying the new woman is the devil in the house. So obviously, very early on, there were religious implications to this new construct for women. And so as in England, so also in the late Ottoman Empire and Republican Turkey, a new woman was emerging. And Halide Edib, gleaning from her firsthand experience of the suffragette movement in Great Britain, produced influential renderings of this woman, this Turkish new woman. The new Turkish national identity figures prominently in Halide Edib's New Woman, By the time she published her novel, The Clown and His Daughter, in 1935, Halide Edib had journeyed far and wide, yes, geographically, but also ideologically. In her book, Türkiye'de Şark, Garp ve Amerikan Tesirleri, or The East, the West, and American Influences in Türkiye, Halide Edib writes of one of her ideals. She writes, quote, "Pan-Turanism was perhaps a more dangerous and more impossible dream than Pan-Slavism." And I have there Jacob Landau's definition of Pan-Turanism, a sort of union, cultural, physical, or both, among peoples of proven or alleged Turkish origin. So thus, Halide Edib is backing down from the ethnic utopia of her novel Yeni Turan, which was published in 1912. She's already questioned her own nationalism in print in her memoirs in 1923, in which she confesses, quote, "I have honestly tried to analyze the inner meaning of my nationalism, whether it can hurt others who are not Turks, the family of nations in the world to which Turkey also belongs," end quote. While even early in her career, Halide Edib promotes dramatic changes in agency, public expression, and even political influence for women in Turkey. During and after her exile, after the establishment of the Republic, she went into exile. With her softening nationalism, her ideal for new womanhood found room to grow. Her social and political ideals developed both nostalgia for Ottoman society and nuance in handling this pull between East and West. Her use of these categories of East and West could be considered problematic, especially considering Edward Said's study of Orientalism. As I'm presenting her perspective, I will be using these terms in the manner that she uses them, and hopefully in exploring what they meant to her. I think there are multiple ways to look at her use of these categories of East and West. One interpretation would be that it's the influence of her American and European teachers. However, she also had Ottoman tutors, one of whom she married, so the influence there is undeniable. Another possible explanation would be that she sees Turkey, for example, she has a book she published called Turkey Faces West. So perhaps she sees Turkey as in a central position, choosing to face either East or West, in which case it can assert agency, being neither one nor the other. So that would actually provide a certain ascendancy or an opportunity in her perspective. A third possibility is, since she expresses strong criticisms of materialism and secularism and the feminist movement even in Europe, and she also criticizes Orientalist depictions of women, particularly women in the harem, then maybe her use of these terms could be interpreted as an anti-Orientalist response to what she experienced from her American and European teachers. But in any case, I imagine that it's probably an amalgamation of these three options, actually. But in any case, she provides a rare perspective because she has this formative experience in the Ottoman Empire and then years of exile in Egypt and then England and France, traveling in the US and in India until she established herself again back in Turkey, where she became a member of parliament and lived the rest of her life. So I think that provides a rare depth and diversity in her perspective. Her novel, The Clown and His Daughter, explores daily life in the late Ottoman Empire under Sultan Abdulhamid II. It reaches back to an Ottoman setting, but reflects Halide Edib's intellectual and cultural evolution. Rabia, a poor girl from a broken family in late Ottoman Constantinople, possesses a mesmerizing singing voice, and her musical gift plays out in moving Quran recitations. Halide Edib illustrates a Turk's ideal relationship with the West through Rabia as a singer with a deep appreciation of both Eastern and Western music, and as a Quran reader married to an ex-priest classical pianist. This evening, we will explore how through Rabia, Halide Edib harmonizes the spiritual and the carnal, the individual and the community, the nation and the world. Addressing marriage, faith, and personal and national identity, Halide Edib uses music in constructing a Turkish new woman who, through male mentors and traditional socio-religious influences, becomes a spiritual inspiration in her community. I will consider first Rabia's individual identity and then her unconventional social role. Typically, early Turkish fiction addresses women's issues through the sufferings of a tragic female victim. Actually, British literature did the same. Halide Edip's exceptional portrayal indicates a new triumphant vision of female identity. Her nationalist and transnational experience appears to have led her to a position poised between the Ottoman past and the progressive future. Rabia's personal identity is intertwined with her music from childhood, and I will trace the evolution of her musical gift to outline Halide Edip's updated feminine ideal. Rabia, named after the 8th century female poet, also later embraced as a Sufi saint, is the granddaughter of a very strict imam, and she mixes elements of her traditional Sunni Muslim upbringing with a prevailing and inclusive Sufi influence. After Selim Pasha, the Sultan's Minister of Internal Affairs, convinces Rabia's grandfather to allow her music lessons under the Pasha's patronage, her voice opens up a new social sphere and agency to her. Rabia's voice provides for her spiritual development and gains her respect from her grandfather and her mother, who become financially dependent on her because of her remunerations for her Quran recitations while she's still a child. Rabia imitates her grandfather's manner of fatherhood in that she supports his living, but avoids any personal relationship or close connection to him. He has little influence on her music. Rabia's countercultural relationship with her grandfather and her spiritual authority suggests that Halide Edib does not intend a traditional spirituality for her new woman ideal. Years later, Rabia determines to leave her grandfather and her mother for her father, Tevfik. Tevfik is the clown in the title, the clown and his daughter. He's a grocer and an amateur actor who returns from banishment after performance in a community theater that was considered shameful. So he's an ex-con and an actor, and she, before she's of mature age, decides to leave her grandfather and her mother and live with her ex-con father. So she's very assertive, even at a young age. She moves in with Tevfik and begins running his grocery store and caring for him really more like a mother than a daughter, quote, taking charge of her big helpless father, end quote. The gender nature of this relationship is complex. Her father tells a family friend that Rabia is, quote, more like a big brother than a daughter, end quote. Defying her mother and grandfather and both mothering and brothering her father, Rabia asserts her will using her singing ability, establishes her own home, and stations herself at the head before she has come of age. Thus, Rabia repeatedly asserts herself extraordinarily for her historical context by determining how male figures will influence her musical and spiritual development. Rabia's carefully crafted spiritual formation seems to reflect a balance Halide Edip recommends for the new woman's spirituality. Rabia does not parallel the dramatic secularization of the early Turkish Republic. In the household of her patron Selim Pasha, Rabia benefits from an array of relationships. Vehbi Effendi, a Sufi mystic, becomes her greatest spiritual influence. Significantly, Halide Edip presents this Sufi figurehead at a time when all of the dervish lodges have been closed. This is 1935. In 1925, legally all of the dervish lodges were closed. So she sets this novel back in a time where she can have as the most admirable religious figure in the novel a Sufi mystic. In addition, Rabia becomes a regular member of the Pasha's son, Hilmi's Salon, a dissident political group of liberals and nationalists called the Young Turks. Moreover, Rabia encounters the Italian musician Peregrini, who becomes a musical inspiration. Rabia combines the sensual power of Peregrini's European classical music with the deep wisdom and peace of Vehbi Effendi's philosophy and the Islamic chanting tradition. In this novel, Halide Edip uses the term chanting rather than the more common Quranic reading or Quranic reciting, probably to emphasize the musical and individual nature of Rabia's voice. And Peregrini, when he hears this voice, describes it in this way, quote, "The contradictory aspects of the girl's nature blend in those moments. She achieves oneness in her chant. She attunes herself to the infinite. Here, even the unbeliever recognizes the spiritual significance of Rabia's singing. Peregrini and Vehbi Effendi understand well Rabia's, quote, dual nature. Her mother and her grandfather are responsible for a, quote, puritanical tendency, the readiness to think and take a definite decision, end quote. However, her, quote, distinct and original personality, end quote, comes from Tefik, as well as her, quote, intense capacity for attachment to human beings, end quote. These sacred and secular influences, along with those of Selim Pasha, Sabiha Hanım, and their son's revolutionary salon, combine to form Rabia's depth and stature as an ideal. It is apparently this rare and diverse combination that Halide Edib finds necessary to transition her nation from its Ottoman past. While Rabia benefits from these varied influences, she maintains musical and spiritual independence from Peregrini. She sustains her religious argument when she receives a marriage proposal from him, a man of no faith and a former Catholic monk. This relationship illustrates the confluence of Eastern piety with Western secularization. Like many in the early Turkish Republic, Rabia struggles with this marriage as some form of personal spiritual failure. She decides that she can't violate this religious barrier and marry a Christian, so he agrees to convert to Islam, at least nominally, in order to marry her. As a personal and social ideal, Rabia unites with the best Europe has to offer while respecting Islamic tradition, religious tradition, and remaining thoroughly ensconced in her neighborhood of Sinekli Bakal, as well as in the upper-class social environment of the Sultan's court. Rabia, in all her exceptional agency for a traditional Ottoman woman, differs significantly from the new republic's modern secular vision. Halide Edib seems to be critiquing that model through Rabia from afar because she's in exile at this point, so she can critique the model. Although Rabia has already determined that she will marry Peregrini even before he asks, when he suggests that they move somewhere where their difference in faith won't matter, the novel says she looks away in silence with, quote, the air of one who had thought out things carefully and had come to definite conclusions, end quote. In her silence, her definite conclusions are not lost on Peregrini. He knows the reasoning and the strong nature of her character, so he doesn't push her. He offers to convert instead. And I think this element highlights an important difference between the English and the Turkish versions of this novel. So it's published as The Clown and His Daughter in English first. That title, as I understand, was actually more the British publisher's idea than Halide Edip's. It was about getting the interest of a British audience. And then a year later, when she publishes it in Turkey, it's called Sinekli Bakal, which is the name of the mahalle, the neighborhood where Rabia lives, and also the name of her father's grocery store. So there's a sense of the significance of place that I think is very important to this new woman ideal that doesn't come out really in the English version in the way that it does in the Turkish version. So when her foreign husband suggests that they move somewhere where their religion won't matter, she doesn't even consider that as an option because Sinekli Bakal is important. And again, when they marry and she could be living around the Sultan's court, she wants to continue living in Sinekli Bakal. So I think it connects to Halide Edip's idea of place and the importance, the value that she gave, for example, to Anatolian culture specifically. So then she decides she can't violate this religious barrier, and they get married, and they live in Sinekli Bakal instead of in the court where he is used to living. So then she has considered what the majority religion forbids and struggled with the impossibility of a Christian and a Muslim marrying, but ultimately she doesn't compromise. While she keeps her faith, her culture, her neighborhood, much of his self is secondary to uniting with her. Apparently, in this marriage of Eastern and Western values, especially European and Ottoman values, the European side is apparently expected to compromise more, much more. Significantly, Peregrini plays classical piano and discusses music with Rabia regularly for years, but early in the novel, he declines to teach her singing in the European classical tradition. Instead, he recommends that she continue in her, quote, perfect art. And he quotes the New Testament when he says, quote, render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's. The child belongs to Allah. Let her remain where she belongs, end quote. So here the European master realizes that Rabia has no need of his training. The beginning to this musical relationship between Rabia and the man who would become her husband suggests Halide Edip's prescription for Turkish society, not only as a community, but in relation to Europe. Peregrini and Rabia interact as equals, and this interaction expands each one's capacities. In addition to the compromise Rabia requires of Peregrini in order to marry her, she consistently maintains her independence after she has married him. During her life-threatening pregnancy, she realizes that Peregrini is also wrestling with a birth, but with a musical creation. When she composes and sings for him a key musical theme for his masterpiece, her voice brings, quote, sudden inspiration, end quote, and he watches her in a moment of epiphany. Quote, he was very conscious of her, but not of her physical being, rather of the force which he had never felt with such awareness. He speaks as if he's experienced here a revelation of her identity. He says to her, quote, I believe you are a song of Allah in person, Rabia. You are not only my wife, you are my inspirer and collaborator, end quote. As Peregrini's muse and musical partner, Rabia provides this melody, demonstrating her ability to transform pain into musical and relational beauty. Peregrini, the unbeliever and European musician, identifies her as the manifestation of divine music. Furthermore, when Peregrini pleads with her to seek an abortion rather than risk this pregnancy, Rabia is resolute in maternal strength, a maternal strength that Halide Edib depicts as more essential even than her Islamic faith. When Rabia's spiritual father, Vehbi Effendi, comes to discuss the pregnancy with her, quote, he who had championed the complete freedom of Rabia's soul now felt a little hurt because it seemed so entirely independent, end quote. When she disturbs him by withholding her soul, as he puts it, he realizes, quote, something stronger than love was at work within her. What could it be except life in its most elemental form, end quote. In motherhood, then, Rabia stands apart from both these figures, from both the Eastern and Western perspectives. She has exceeded even her spiritual teacher, connecting in spirit and body with the essence of life. Her decision to risk her life for the babies is entirely independent, and indeed, in spite of these two men, her musical and spiritual mentors. Thus, music is the measure by which the novel combines Eastern and European values and tracks the female protagonist's spiritual development. So moving from her personal identity to her social identity, a key instance of the social power in Rabia's voice is the occasion when she sings about the birth of the prophet at the Princess Najat's house, at the first Chamberlain's house with her guests. Rabia's voice there expresses the suffering in a way that causes a catharsis for a whole community of listeners. In her memoirs, Halide Edib describes this birth narrative stirred her, quote, highest religious emotions, end quote. She says, quote, the poem is by a simple Turkish poet. Here she refers to Süleyman Çelebi, a 14th century Ottoman imam in Bursa. And I know nothing more beautiful in literature than that unpretentious and unconscious revelation of a great soul in the throes of pain for suffering humanity, end quote. Thus, Halide Edib exalts this tale of a mother in labor as the ultimate in heroism and compassion for humanity. This song, united with Rabia's voice, creates a communal exploration of the reaches of human emotion and experience. When Rabia presents her own rendition of this beloved Mevlud, Her audience is enchanted. And from the novel here, quote, with the first notes, the kneeling crowd began to wave like a field of white daffodils when the winds of the open blow freely on the surface. Soft sighs, heavy sighs, single sobs in chorus joined in her chant, but the chanter, whether conscious or unconscious of the general emotion, continued to describe in melody the feelings and fancies of a woman in travail, end quote. Displaying a heightened sense of poetry, Halide Edib decorates this communal experience of the court women observing the prophet's birth with the daffodil, a flower connected with spring festivals such as the Persian Nowruz and the Christian Lent. Although this song and its tradition are Islamic, when Rabia performs it, she innovates, singing the beginning in a major key as she deems appropriate for the celebration of birth. Moreover, Halide Edib clearly connects the traditional Turkish song to universal feminine experience. The narrator asks, quote, is not every child when it descends upon earth a messenger of God, end quote. The women listening to Rabia represent in their, quote, collective passion something supremely human, end quote. Moreover, at dinner the next day, when Vehbi Effendi remarks that Rabia's version of the Mevlud was not traditional, the princess says that she detected, quote, an air of Signor Peregrini's improvisations, end quote, in Rabia's performance. Rabia's music and her spiritual identity are apparently a mixture, reflecting a variety of influences across faiths, cultures, and social strata, a mixture into which she is drawing her Ottoman community. When Rabia transitions to the death portion of the song, those gathered mourn together with, quote, an agony of fear at the inevitable end of human life. Hysteria had taken hold of them all, end quote. Behind a curtain, the first chamberlain and some other men are also listening. A nurse later tells Rabia that the chamberlain said Rabia's version of the birth song was the most beautiful he had ever heard. Quote, he was crying with emotion just as much as the women on the side of the curtain, end quote. So at least a small coterie of men is equally moved, though the stereotypically feminine word hysteria complicates the description. As with Rabia's personal identity, her public identity, enabled and defined by her music, merges the traditional and the transnational as Rabia universalizes this beloved medieval Turkish song. As to folk music in Rabia's musical blossoming, once Tevfik and Rabia have settled into their home, Tevfik wants to resume his community theater performances. Rabia suggests that she could sing during these, and her father reacts, asking how a Quran chanter could, quote, sing silly songs and play the tambourine, end quote. He thinks she should be performing in proper style, slow and regal. Her style, quote, wouldn't do for the street children and the outcast, end quote. Obviously, Halide Edib doesn't agree, and Rabia then spends some of her happiest moments dancing and singing with her father and his friends. Her development deliberately involves a departure from the strict extremes of her Imam grandfather and a wider experience than just singing in the Ottoman court. The expansion of her musical knowledge represents the development of her spiritual voice and her ability to express her worldview in a fusion of sacred and secular music. Furthermore, and perhaps most countercultural of all, Halide Edib gives her new woman a voice that spans social classes in the usually rigidly compartmentalized Ottoman society. Rabia's social influence extends to imperial elites, outliers, mystics, agnostics, working class believers, and even to criminals. The deep friendship between Rabia and Rakim, a performer with dwarfism who is often asked by strangers to dance or to imitate a monkey, the way she treats him illustrates her maturing ability to counter social prejudices. She incorporates Rakim into her home and into the grocery business, and thus into the small insular community of Sinekli Bakal. At times, this ennobling grace appears to be a freedom almost unique to women in the novel. Male characters are captive to political authorities. Selim Pasha, for example, betrays his own son in loyalty to the Sultan. Rabia's grandfather, in his legalistic religious perspective, is consumed by anger and condemns his community of Sinekle Bakal. These social and religious ties prevent men from serving the common good as freely as some of the female characters, such as Rabia and Sabiha Hanım, the Pasha's wife. But Rabia also brings a transformation in Selim Pasha himself, when he, as the Sultan's security advisor, allows Rabia's father and even his own son to be exiled. Rabia, as the community's moral compass, denounces this as a cold betrayal. Yet in the end, after he resigns his position with the Sultan, she forgives him, and she comes to visit Sabiha Hanım and reads parts of her father's letters from exile. Selim Pasha is listening in the background, and as she reads, he begins to think of all the suffering that he participated in as security advisor. Quote, he had never thought of the exiles as individuals, end quote, until that moment. So this great man experiences his first pangs of self-awareness, compassion, and regret under Rabia's voice. Rabia represents a tempered ideal through which Halide Edib balances some of her previous perspectives on national and international movements. Although Rabia is a member of Hilmi Salon of the Young Turks and regularly associates with them, and despite Halide Edib's own association, as I mentioned earlier, she was designated Mother of Turks by the Young Turks. Rabia, however, does not seem to imbibe their ideologies or participate in their activities. Moreover, the narrator and multiple sympathetic characters in the novel sharply criticize Hilmi and his ideas. Rabia also does not stir the public to revolutionary action, as Halide Edib herself did during the meeting in Sultanahmet Square. Furthermore, Rabia is not the blazing insurgent figure that Ayşe was, for example, in possibly Halide Edib's most famous novel, Ateşten Gömlek, or The Shirt of Flame. After the Republic was established and Halide Edib is in self-imposed exile, she published in Europe this novel set back in history to the late Ottoman Empire, likely in a corrective move against what she saw as excessive westernization and secularization in her estranged homeland. Rabia speaks to her society in song rather than in combative rhetoric. Her voice is spiritual, passionate, nostalgic, and unifying. This moderated voice may have emerged from Halide Edib's own experience with the British suffragette movement and British feminism in general. Her comments about this suffrage movement in England while she was a guest there are not complimentary, actually. She recorded in the Akşam newspaper, so again, her audience here would be Turks and not British people, so she's speaking her mind. She was repulsed by the need for fencing when she visited Parliament in the balconies to prevent women, feminist women, from throwing projectiles at the speakers in Parliament. She criticizes these suffragettes' actions as, quote, azgın ve faul feminism, or furious and activist feminism, and contrasts their isyan, or riot, with women who were volunteering childcare, for example, to working women in British society. In Caitlin Stout's view, with this novel's historical setting, ending concurrent with the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, Halide Edib intends to, quote, project an alternative future out of the Ottoman past, end quote. Rabia, as an ideal of Turkish womanhood, quote, then becomes one of the outmoded dreams of modernity that Edib brings back into circulation by projecting her retroactively out of the Ottoman past, end quote. Halide Edib, it appears, artfully depicted the changes she wanted to see for women and national identity in the new Turkish Republic. In the conclusion of her series of lectures at the National Muslim University in New Delhi, given the same year that this novel was published, Halide Edib wrote, quote, the key of the future will belong to that nation which knows how to blend the material and the spiritual, end quote. The West, in these lectures, she characterizes by materialism. To this materialism, her novel adds the beautiful, if dizzying, complexity of Western music. This music likely connects with the Western contribution she prescribes in these lectures, which is administrative organization. To enrich its society, then, the Turkish Republic might embrace Western developments in managing the material world, the essence, like Rabia's spiritual identity, would remain untouched. After the events of the Turkish War for Independence, the establishment of the Republic of Turkey, and Halide Edip's own travels during her exile, she presents this modified view of her national ideal. She says, quote, "I say nationhood and not nationalism, for the former brings into play and harmonizes inner forces in all their variety, while the latter may cause inner disintegration and create conflict with the surrounding peoples," end quote. Rabia's voice, then, may reflect what Halide Edip wished her own voice had been in the past historic turmoil, a balance of her national and transnational experience and observations. Thank you.